Support for this episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere is made possible by the Wessex Press, the premier publisher of books about Sherlock Holmes and his world. Find them online at wessexpress.com.
Also, by Holmes, Doyle, and Friends 6, March 29th and 30th in Dayton, Ohio. Check them out online at agratreasurers.net. I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 161, Canon Law.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a chronicler.
In a world where it's always 1895, comes I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we discuss goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts, the Baker Street Irregulars, and popular culture related to the great detective.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Burt Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
Well, order in the podcasting court. Welcome once again to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Burt Wolder.
And I am the law to your order, Burt. I am the Sam Waterston to your Jerry Orbach.
Well, I wouldn't mind being Jerry Orbach to anybody. That's great. Well, actually, I'm an order of hash fries, so we're completely incompatible.
Hey, I like hash fries.
Success.
This is episode 161, as we noted, which of course means you can find the show notes at ihose.co/ihose161. There you can find links to things that we'll talk about on this episode. You can find ways to support our sponsors and all kinds of tricks and trinkets. And of course, that is the place where if you want to leave a comment about what you've heard today, you can certainly do that. You can also leave us an email. If you mail us at comment@ihearofsherlock.com and let us know what you think of the show. You can also comment on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, wherever you like, and we will get your note. And I should note our phone number, 774-221-READ, 774-221-7323. I'm embarrassed to say that it was rerouting to a different phone number, a different mailbox, and I just checked in there, and there were a few voicemails from throughout 2018. And,
oh, my God.
Yeah, I apologize that we missed those. It would seem a little silly to go back and play those now, but...
go ahead.
Maybe
go ahead.
Well, maybe we'll queue them up in future episodes and see what we can do. But we do want to thank you for doing that. We have figured out what the glitch is, so let's see if we can work around that. All right. Meanwhile, we have this message from our friends way out Wessex.
February 14 is coming, and we in the ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex prepare to welcome Erot, the winged sprite, whose arrows of love herald the coming of spring. But you are already smiling, because you're reading Baker Street Reveries, Sherlockian Writings 2006 to 2016 by Leslie S. Klinger. Klinger's Holmesian writings covering everything from Sherlockian erotica to the hitherto lost correspondence between Conan Doyle and John H. Watson. This book is available right now at wessexpress.com. Friends, on this Valentine's Day, recall the smiles that win, the tints that glow, that tell of days in goodness spent, a mind at peace with all below, a heart whose love is innocent. The perfect gift for your beloved Sherlockian just may be a volume from the Wessex Press. Choose yours today.
I certainly hope those hardy people in the ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex aren't experiencing cold, bad weather in their particular parts of England. You know, in very cold weather, the whole press freezes because there really isn't enough alcohol. The good news is there's enough alcohol in the people who run the press, but there's not enough alcohol in the ink.
Well, we'll find a way to squeeze it out, no question. Well, in the meantime, we are pleased to be joined here today by two members of the Baker Street Irregulars who were the editors of one of the latest books coming out of the BSI Press. Canon Law, Lawyers, Law, and the Sherlockian Canon is the title. This is the second in the Baker Street Irregulars Professions series. You may remember the first, called Nerve and Knowledge. We'll have a link to the show notes there where we interviewed Bob Katz. And was Andy Solberg on that show as well? I think he was, because he's in the health profession. So we interviewed the two of them on that one as well. But we are here to talk to Will Walsh and Donny Zaldin. And since they are both at the end of the alphabet, I'm going to make them wait. No, let's get right to it. Will Walsh, known as Godfrey Norton in the BSI, graduated from the American School in Japan and Haverford College and the University of Minnesota Law School. He works as an environmental lawyer in New York, and he just celebrated his 25th wedding anniversary with his wife Marion while working on this book. What a romantic. An original member of the Baskerville Bash, Will is an officer of the Three Garridibs of Westchester County and belongs to the Hudson Valley Scientists and strives to attend regular Ash Wednesday gatherings. And also Donny Zaldin, John Hector McFarlane in the BSI. How appropriate. He served with the Bootmakers of Toronto. Of course, that's the National Sherlock Holmes Society in Canada, in multiple leadership roles, including President, Consigliere, Colonel Ross, Quizmaster, Diarist, over the past quarter century. He's been published in the Baker Street Journal, the Serpentine Muse, Explorations, and, of course, Canadian Holmes. He's contributed as an author and editor to the BSI manuscript series, including Dancing to Death and Deadly Harpoon, The Magic Door, which is the Friends of the ACD collection at the Toronto Public Library, and Sherlockian.net. He's made presentations at various international Sherlockian conferences and serves as Colonel Ross and chair of the triennial Can-Am BSI Bot Silver Blaze Race and Conference in Toronto. Say that 3 times fast. In his non-Sherlockian life, Donny is a barrister at law in the area of family law and is married and devoted to the Bootmakers and his own certain gracious lady, Barbara Rush, with whom he shares 6 children and 15 grandchildren. Well, Donny and Will, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening.
Well, this is always a treat for us when we get to have a pair of editors on. We'll try and be fair and transparent about how we go back and forth so we don't leave you both scrambling for the microphone at the same time. But we'll start out where we start with everyone that joins us on the show here and talk about your first meeting with Sherlock Holmes. Why don't we start with you, Will?
First meeting that I recall was either WOR or WPIX broadcast in the rather than dated, when I was probably about 6.
Oh, wow.
And it was one of the Rathbone films that was on, and I remember coming back to the house and looking at my father and saying, it was just absurd. There is no way someone can be, looking at things and coming up with all that information, which ended up being an introduction to Holmes and a lifelong adventure. Also the discovery that Doyle was my grandfather's favorite author for The White Company.
Oh, wow. That's rather unusual.
It is a little different.
So did you come from a whole family of Doyle admirers, or was it just your grandfather?
Well, I mean, my grandfather, my father, either or anyone, the three of you may recall, he did the canonical ship paintings that were about 20 years now removed from selling, but he painted after he retired from work, he went into watercolors and painted a series of ships for a Three Garadebs meeting where he detailed the development of ships going from the Gloria Scott to the Bass Rock using canonical ships as his illustrations.
Now, were any of those used in the, I guess it would have been the BSI Press book Mobile Homes?
They were not, but Walter Jaffe has independently put out a little pamphlet that has the collection of paintings as well. If you recall, also at the dinner last year, the Bruce Partington illustration that was put up during the dinner and then auctioned off the following day was a painting he did of that submarine.
And Donny, how about you? When did you first have your first run-in with Sherlock Holmes?
When I was young, and I was a sports guy, but I also read detective stuff. I read the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew, and I read some Sherlock Holmes stories in my early teens. And then my wife Barbara was confined to bed for the last, I'm going to say, trimester of the birth of one of our 6 children, and she read the canon from cover to cover, and so I got back into it then, and that child was in his 40s now, and we joined the Bootmakers of Toronto, and the stories are taken sequentially at story meetings, and it just got back into it, let's say, from early 80s on. And I have this joke, because we fill out these profiles and some people are interviewed, and the usual question is you asked, so what was your introduction? When did you first read the canon? Well, my joke is I got about 3 more stories in the casebook to finish it. Anyways, I've read a lot of the the earlier ones more times and stuff like that, but I'm pretty up on it and do okay at quizzes and at the Bootmakers of Toronto, and so that catches me up to. Well, not quite as. Anyways, that's my intro and re-intro.
Well, the good news is, Donny, that the casebook is copyright free in Canada, so have at it.
Yeah. Okay. Follow that court case pretty carefully. And when Barbara and I went to visit one of our kids and daughter married a Brit, and we have 3 grandchildren in England. When we went over there, we stayed with the Doyles, and sat in, and we slept in a room, and can you imagine, it was Catherine Beggs and her brother, and we were sitting in a room, like our bedroom was such that they said, would you like to see our family album, like our family photo album, which normally bores you to tears, and pulled out this album of Arthur Conan Doyle and Jean and the kids and stuff like that, and it was a real spooky thing, and we just, anyways, that's just part of our attraction and love of Doyle and Sherlock Holmes, and because we also belong to the Arthur Conan Doyle Society and the collection, the collection here in Toronto.
Yeah, we had Peggy Perdue on the program. I guess it would have been back on episode 123 or so, if I recall correctly. She talked with us about the about the collection there. So that's wonderful that you're so close by and so involved there.
Yeah, Peggy's a dear friend, and she was a hell of a curator and has sort of been promoted up the library scale and hierarchy, and she's got pretty big shoes to fill. Very accomplished Sherlockian.
No doubt. All right. Well, why don't we talk about how you two came together? I mean, this book, Canon Law, is part of the BSI Press Professions series. I guess this is the second book in the Professions series. The first, of course, having been Nerve and Knowledge, something we covered here on a previous episode. And by the way, all these episodes that we're mentioning, we will have a link to these in the show notes, so you can go back and check them later at your convenience. If you are listening along and you don't have a screen in front of you, if you're driving or if you're out jogging or something like that, we don't want anyone to stumble. So we'll have those in the show notes. So this is the second in the Profession series, and this has to do with law. We know from your intros that both of you are in the legal profession by trade, but why the two of you? Why were you picked?
Yeah, I think that this falls initially on me. If my memory is correct, back in 2016, as Nerve and Knowledge was coming out, or the word of it coming out was hit, my thought was and it was sort of a discussion over the weekend, that a book on the legal profession would be appropriate. I then sat and spent about the next 2 weeks doing some research through the electronic version of the BSJ, for which, Scott, you deserve a lot of kudos. Reading articles that had appeared in the journal previously with regard to the law, there were, in my mind, surprisingly few of them. I used those over to sort of plot out and draft out potential articles / chapters for the book. Drafted that up and sent it after a couple of edits and smoothing out to Michael Keane, Bob Katz, and I believe John Berquist as a book proposal. After their, hearing back and hearing an interest from them, it was also suggested that finding assistance would be strongly recommended. It was probably the best advice I gotten in the process. I've known Donny since some early Baskerville Bash days, and thought that the addition of someone more familiar with the English law was ideal, and it proved to be, and contacted and reached out to Donny.
Talk a little bit more about that, Will, about how the architecture and focus of the book came about, because it's interesting. On one hand, you can look at the cases of Sherlock Holmes, the world's first consulting detective who occasionally assists the uniformed members of the police force, but also quite frequently refuses, when he can easily do so, to help them obtain an evildoer that he himself has put on another path. So there's a lot about Sherlock Holmes and the law, and this book covers it, that's really involved in sort of skating around the law in one way or another. But when you did that original look at what had been written and your own thoughts about Holmes, how did that bubble up to you?
Actually, I would say, Bert, that my initial thoughts, and it sort of ended up at least driving how, my initial thoughts on the book, and Donny can add to it, I think we sort of stuck with it, was when you go through law school, as opposed to reading a mystery and looking at it, you're very segregated out in what subject you're taking. You can have an entire semester on commercial paper and an entire semester on secured transactions and another one on wills and trusts, and another one on education law or family law, or, but it's all very much broken down into subjects. And, as the introduction sort of hints at, there are then books on the subjects, there are study books on the subject, there are notes on the subjects, but you get sort of these stacks of things, each regulated by the subject. And so my thought was to look at legal issues that pop up within the canon and provide sort of that initial reference point for if someone wants to know what the insanity defense is, they can now go to Mike Miller's article on the development of that defense, where it stood in Victorian law, and use that as the foundation for wherever they want to go in discussing the cardboard box or other cases. And it was really breaking down sort of legal subject areas. And then it was sort of critical to reach out to Donny, because other than sitting with Blackstone on someone's shelf, I'm not sure that, the subject areas are consistent today versus where they were 120 years ago. And so working those out took a little bit of effort.
Can I cut in? To just bring forward what Will's saying?
Absolutely.
Will and I go back to the Baskerville Bash and the Gaslight Gala, and we're a little bit different. I mean, the Will's probably a little bit more formal, and I'm a little bit more informal than he is, and we just, say compliment ENT each other, and what's I going to say that the connection was, I said to him one time, like we were talking about it, and he said, "You make me laugh," because, I did a couple of skits at the Bash. So anyways, they asked Will to do the book. I remember the story he told me. He said, "I assume that, the co-editor would be another lawyer. Is there any other, are there any other conditions?" And they said, "Yeah, you can choose anybody from this list of 5 people." So they vetted 5 people, and I was on the list. So Will called me, and so I said to him jokingly, I said, "Well, I guess everybody's turned you down because you're down to Z, the last one in alphabetical order." He says, "No, actually, I called you first." So I said, I'm honored, and I'd absolutely be delighted to do that. And I write and Sherlockian stuff and like non-legal stuff. And I was most interested in the project, and we got going. And I'm very pleased to tell you, but not surprised, that it's like when you go on a trip with somebody that but not so well. And at the end, the question always is, would you go on another trip with that person? Well, Will and I are better friends and closer than when we started this project. So I think that speaks volumes about it. And early on in the piece, Will said to me, we were trying to, he was formulating what he'd done, the work that he'd done, and the prep, let's say, or build up, and he came up with what I don't know, the vision, that's what I called it, or the format of what we were going to do. And he called it like a primer, like a British primer of law during what we call the Sherlockian age, say from 1887 to 1930, or when Conan Doyle died, and broke it down into criminal because, Holmes is a consulting detective and he solved mysteries and mostly crimes. And then you had all these legal issues and some civil issues about property and matrimonial law and trusts and stuff like that had to do with some of those cases. And that was Will's vision, and he pitched it to me, and I said, "That's brilliant." And we just jumped on that horse and wrote it, and we'd like to think that, anyways, it's out, and that people are going, that not just Sherlockians are going to read this. That we're trying. I don't know if outreach is the right word, but we're trying to like, I've been to my law library. There are a couple in Toronto. To sell the book and waiting on an answer, and because I think that it's something valuable for, especially we're, still a Commonwealth country, and the common law, a little bit different than the States, but it's descended from British law, and so that's where our history and the origins are, and that's where we wound up.
That's really interesting. When you both, Donny, let's just stay with you for a second. When you think of that age, what you describe as the Sherlockian age, law in the Sherlockian age, say from the 1880s to the 1930s, was that a time? I mean, I'm asking this from a standpoint of total ignorance. Was that a time of minimal change, of substantial change in the law? Because you look at other professions, medicine, discoveries, science, physics, big things happened between 1880 and 1930. Was it the same in the law?
I don't think it moved as fast in law as it would in, for example, in medicine or science or stuff like that. Because, divorce law was, we got a smattering of it in the canon, with Holmes's comments and Doyle's, work for divorce reform in England, and it pours out. But eventually, they changed it, but it was very gradual. And you remember, Britain and the United States, women were they didn't have the vote, and they only had property rights a little bit earlier when they enacted changes. So it wasn't as thinking of an adjective or adverb, but it didn't advance as quickly, in my opinion, as medicine, for example, and the other sciences. You agree, Will?
I would. The British development of British law, I'm not as sound on. Things like constitutional law in the States, really, the first serious series of First Amendment cases, which is where people usually look, didn't start until towards the end of World War I. And then there was a brief break, and then with the Hughes Court in the 30s, Oliver Wendell Holmes, looking to another Holmes, did draft the Common Law as a book, which was sort of the first effort to put a detailed collection on the law in early 1880s, I think. But I would say, unlike as a result of the industrial age, no, it was more the law was reacting as opposed to keeping pace. And so, you see it in changes with labor law and protection for workers. They tended to come 5, 10, 15 years after the issues really started to become problems as states were passing different legislation. So no, I go back to the original question. I think the law tended to lag a little behind other development.
Well, maybe as a way of getting closer to the contents of the book and the structure of the book, let me ask you sort of an introductory question. How would you rate Conan Doyle by what you perceive to be, Will, his knowledge of the law? On a sort of a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being Oliver Wendell Holmes, and 2 being Perry Mason, let's say.
I think the easier response to that, I think his knowledge of the law was a little better than his knowledge of Mormons. It was one of the surprising things when I thought about it, or when people thought about it, because I had not thought about it in laying out for this book and drafting it, and it came up with a couple of notes. The fact that despite all the work that Holmes does in arresting or detaining, in many of the cases, the criminal villain, and others letting him go, there's actually not a single trial scene or really discussion of a court at all in any of the 60 stories within the canon. I think Doyle largely did his best to avoid the law. in most of his discussions, or in his efforts in converting what Watson placed before him, he would probably edit it out so it wasn't distracting from the text.
Yeah, that's a good observation. I mean, Doyle was mostly concerned with puzzles, deductions, and denouement, and in some cases, as we all well know, there was no crime at all at the end of the day when you unraveled certain of these cases.
Yeah, you think about it in parlance of modern terminology or perhaps, popular association with all things legal, Law and Order. This perfectly written television show where you've got half dealing with the police who investigate crimes and the other half dealing with the legal profession who prosecute them. And in Holmes's case, it was really all order and no law.
Fortunately, he was not turning his cases over to Rumpel, but
if I might, I'm going to use this as I'm going to call it a perfect segue to the contents of the book, because the opening chapter is harkens to Watson's list of 12 of Sherlock Holmes's limits when they just became roommates, and Watson's trying to figure out what his quotes his work is. He works in the lab, but he's not registered with the university, and so on. And he makes that list of knowledge of literature, knowledge of astronomy, something else in geology, and something else was varied, and the 12th and last item on the list was, it said Sherlock Holmes has a good practical knowledge of British law. So the opening chapter examines whether Watson got it right or got it wrong. And, by going through the stories, and there have been articles in journals, and this article went a little bit farther, but I'm going to leave it to readers to check it out and see if they agree. And if they agree with the assessment, if their assessment of the assessment is correct, and then I'm gonna, not shameless promotion, but segue to the last article, the last chapter in the book, which is really where everything was headed. It was the trial of Sherlock Holmes for breaking the law, charged with breaking the law while he was solving mysteries and crimes, and whether or not he broke into Irena Adler's or Milverton's, or obstructed justice by letting say Crocker go and Dr. Sterndale and so on. And there's a trial with an indictment, and then we farmed out the Crown's case. So two lawyers wrote a brief. It's set in 1919 when the trial happens, and it's literally a brief. And then there's Sherlock Holmes, who obviously wouldn't hire a lawyer because he knows better, representing himself, and makes his final statement, and then it's up to the judge. So, Will, why don't you tell how we got how we handled the judgment of the court and your search, okay?
Sure, and I guess in thinking back, I guess Bert threw up a softball to get into the lead of the book, and I just missed it completely. I mean, quite honestly, in the end, if you're doing a book on the law and the canon, there is one individual within the BSI who, sort of everyone will expect to be there. And in advance of handing out sections of the book and doing the book and drafting writers for chapters, about the only time I heard any comment from Mike Whalen or anyone else on the issue was, "You've talked to Al about this, right?" was Mike's question to me. And, Al Rosenblatt was brilliant. He stepped in as the high court for the decision in the case of Rex v. Holmes. Worthy of everyone's time and reading without the spoiler, other than I think his observation towards Watson in the original decision may be the line of the book. And his decision, I reached out and made the request, and Al was more than willing to do it and provided a great decision for us. By way, sort of a backdrop to this, part of the idea for the trial goes to another interest that I have. There was a book that came out a number of years ago with regard to a trial of Richard III and whether or not he murdered Edward V and his brother Richard in the Tower, which Justice Rehnquist ended up sitting and presiding over in the trial. And this was actually a seminar that happened and developed into a book. And certainly from our perspective, our Chief Justice was willing to come in and rule in the Crown's case.
Oh, I remember that book. Now, what was the verdict in the Richard III case unproved? Is that where that came out?
That's correct.
Yeah, that was great. Boy, I hadn't thought about that in a while.
I'm just going to add to that Mr. Justice Rosenblatt's decision was what we call the cherry on top of the sundae. It just was the high point of the book to our mind, and finished it off better than we could possibly anticipate it. We had very high expectations, and again, I'm very pleased to say that every single one of our authors and their articles or chapters exceeded expectations. Every single writer.
That's fantastic.
It doesn't get better than that. They made it easy for us to edit.
Now that we're through the BSI weekend, it's time to start considering what other Sherlockian events we'll be going to throughout the year. You've heard us talk before on this show about scintillation of scions and, of course, Holmes, Doyle, and Friends. Well, guess what? It's time for Holmes, Doyle, and Friends 6. That's right. It is the 6th iteration of this fine conference in Dayton, Ohio. It's taking place March 29th and 30th, 2019, from Friday evening through Saturday evening. Registration, I tell you, is a bargain at $60. The early bird discount is available through March 14th, and it includes a Friday night reception, box lunch on Saturday, and all of the programming in between. Dan Andriaco of the Agra Treasurers puts on a really marvelous program here. And it's not just Dan. He'll be the first to tell you that. It's the entire team of the Agra Treasurers. But the event looks absolutely worth your while. Surprise for some of the folks in the area. This is for those of you in the Midwest or who will make the trek to the Midwest. Half of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere will be attending and speaking on the program. You have to show up to see which half it is. Anyway, get over to agratreasurers.net and register for Holmes, Doyle, and Friends 6th, March 29th and 30th, 2019, and make that trip to Dayton, Ohio. We hope to see you there.
Well, you've talked a little bit about how the framework of the book came about, and we already know some interesting things. So this conversation is sort of evolving as one of Holmes's cases. We know that we begin with his knowledge of the British law, and we know that we end with Rex v. Sherlock Holmes with a decision of the court that we will not disclose. So what was the path in the middle for you? Holmes deals with so much, with punishment, with murder, with divorce, as we mentioned. How did the rest of the dominoes fall for you all?
I'll tell you the skeleton and let Will put the flesh on it, because it was divided into mostly criminal stuff like insanity and the self-defense and those weighty issues. There was an article about, it said trials, but non-trials. There was an article on expert evidence, and then there were some civil matters. So I think the Noble Bachelor, was it the breach of promise to marry Do I have the right story, Will?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so there's an article on breach of promise to marry in a very famous, what we call a lurid, court case, and that's gone into detail, and there's a chapter on expert evidence. Take it from there.
My thought process, anyway, in part was you really don't want a book that is going to be entirely legal treatises. So there was a bit of a parsing out, but the real sort of questions are, and Bert, you identified it from the starting of the subject. Well, we start with murder. So that is one of the early chapters in the book, the different versions of or elements of homicide. Ira did a brilliant job in working through, identifying each of the cases. He was perhaps the most diligent, to the point where we'd already sent the articles off and collected to the printer. And he came up with, I remembered one more that needs to get into a footnote. Can you, send this on? And, we assured him we could, and we passed it on to Marcia, and it was edited in.
He did that 5 times, though.
As I said, he was very diligent and it's a great piece.
He's a regular Columbo.
Exactly. One more question, one more citation.
But the subject sort of broke down. Donnie's memory may be different from mine, but I think we had most of the subjects set, and then it was a matter of finding the right authors or what people willing to do it. And it was a matter of contacting them. In each case, these are people who are, well, with 2 exceptions. Everyone is currently an employed attorney doing work full time. They were, volunteered their time and did a great job pulling together their articles. The 2 exceptions are Bill Mason, who did sort of a vengeance versus justice article, which, he deserved killing, and it's a thought piece a little more than a legal piece. And then Tony Sarnecki, who is a professor at John Jay, if I remember correctly, wrote a piece on British prisons. To the extent that you're looking at the law, that article seemed to need to go in because at the end of the day, who was going, the prison was where some of these people would end up. And, oddly enough, there's not a whole lot of literature within, canonical research on what prison life was like. And so I think that chapter added, further value to the book.
Well, and that leads me kind of back to the beginning of the conversation, Will, where you talked about doing the research and finding precious little about legal matters in the established literature, the BSJ in particular. Why do you think it is that lawyers haven't done terribly much work here? Is it because of the demands of the profession, or that they simply weren't asked by anyone, or where do you think that deficiency lies?
I'll first qualify it with the exception, one of the significant exceptions of a Canadian who Donny may want to address, but Tupper Bigelow, who likes to write on the law, or liked to write on the law to the point where he wrote a paper for the BSJ in the late 50s, talking about Holmes' willingness to violate the law left and right. And then 3 years or 4 years later came out with an alternate piece saying, the guy who wrote that article a couple of years ago doesn't know what he's talking about, and took an entirely different position. I think it in part goes back to the discussion that there are no trials within the canon. One of the chapters that is not written here is the one that it does get a fair amount of coverage within the literature, and that's inheritance in the Norwood Builder. And we just sort of elected fairly early on not to do that piece because it is one that has been written about a number of times, and the validity of an attorney working on a will for which he will inherit and other issues within that are, have been addressed. So look to other things, and, again, things like getting Holmes qualified as an expert witness, which Ross Davies did, is just not something that people had thought about in terms, because Holmes, as near as the canon has, never appears in court as an expert. So, why address what he needs to be done to qualify him?
In addition to the black letter law and the different subject areas of criminal law and civil law, there were topics, chapters on blackmail and property rights, which led to those cases where stepfathers were taking advantage of stepchildren's trust funds, etc. One of the other members of the ensemble beside Holmes and Watson, an article on whether or not Mycroft was a spy, which is well researched.
Well, I'm glad to say that Will brought up, and in the book there's a lovely footnote in Ira's essay mentioning Tupper Bigelow and his arguments about Sherlock Holmes and misprision of felony, taking at one point, as you said, the negative view, and the other point the positive view, because he was such an instrumental and remarkable early irregular. But speaking of really interesting people, can we talk a little bit about Peter Horrocks? Because in the chapter that Peter did, you take a look at the intersection between matrimonial law and criminal law. And this is interesting in so many ways, not the least of which is that Holmes frequently encounters husbands and wives whose relationship is integrating and disintegrating all over again. And Conan Doyle himself was a proponent of divorce law reform. So can you talk a little bit about how you engaged Peter and, what that subject area means to you both?
Well, I'm not so sure that we engaged Peter. He had, he ran with this topic to expand, to cover both areas and how they interrelated with each other. Do you remember, Will?
As far as his article on the or connecting the law with Abbey Grange, Peter, it's odd because I think I've met him in passing once, and our discussion has been solely through email. He's been absolutely marvelous in pulling together the article, but it really was going back to one of the early questions, of how this was pulled together. It became a question early on of when Donny and I were looking for authors. All right, who are the attorneys within the Sherlockian world who we can add and get written? And my first, I reached out to a couple of people for getting recommendations. Peter was one of the people who was recommended pretty much every time as the ideal person to get. And in the end, it was really, as Donny was suggesting, an email to him saying, we're doing this. There are a couple of areas of the law that aren't covered. Here they are, unless you have a different idea. And he proposed his article, and it fit perfectly. I was hoping to run into him, and he may have been here for the birthday weekend this year, and I just didn't catch him, but was hoping to run into him.
He wasn't here.
Okay, fair enough.
Well,
I just wanted to thank him for a great article.
Yeah, Peter is certainly well regarded both in the Sherlockian and legal circles. So it was a real treat to see his name included in there. And there are no. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, Scott. His name was actually, if I recall correctly, when I first reached out to Steve Rothman, and as I recall, Peters was the first name he gave me. Worked well.
Yeah. Well, and there are no shortage of lawyers in Sherlockian societies. You look around the BSI, you look around the Scions, it seems to attract a decent number of lawyers, which is interesting because we lost a towering figure in the Sherlockian and legal community at the end of December. Of course, I'm referring to David Hammer. And there's a quote from an interview that David did with the Nashville Scholars that we included in his his obituary on the site where he said most lawyers belong to a rather dull group. It's the unusual one that has an interest outside of the law. And if the interest is intensive, as matters that are literary or philosophical usually are, you don't find lawyers there. And he goes on, I remember I came back home at Christmas after my first 6 months in the practice of law, and my father asked me if I had any disappointments. And I said, yes, Dad, I do. Just 2. One is the bench, and the other is the bar.
The bench and the bar.
But it seems that we have attracted, at least throughout the halls of the BSI and associated science societies, those individuals from the legal profession that are interesting and that are interested in this kind of thing.
I have a theory on that. I think that lawyers are, you're taught to think in a certain orderly and progressive way, layering, etc., to a conclusion. And isn't that what Sherlock Holmes did? You look at the pageant drawings and you can see like one of him. He gets a client and then he's smoking the pipe, so he's pondering the problem. And the next thing, he's on the train, if you remember that image, to go out to the site, let's say, and then he's on the ground. I think it was the Boscombe Valley, he's flat on the ground, and then, until he solves the crime and either washes the face of the man with the twisted lip or something like that. And then I think the last one, image in my mind of the end is I think the naval treaty where, he lifts one of Mrs. Hutchins', silver, food platters and there's the treaty, underneath it. That was his joke and so on. So I think that it dovetails, but I think you're absolutely right that I know a lot of lawyers who don't think out of the box, and there's such an interesting, there's not an over-representation, but there's a really good representation of lawyers in the BSI and in Sherlockian societies, beneath that or beside that, that have people with this hobby, this interest, this you got a vocation and a vocation, and you have both, and it's just been a delight. I think that there are a lot of lawyers who, Will and I feel very honored. There were a lot of lawyers who would have liked to have edited this book, and we drew we won the lottery, let's say.
Yeah, it was a very good selection.
On Scott, I'd actually somewhat take exception with the statement. While I appreciate it, and it may go for bond attorneys or maybe some of the insurance folks, but I think in the end, particularly for litigators, litigators are always writing to persuade. You're at your heart, you're a storyteller, looking and taking the facts and crafting them on a motion to persuade the judge, or at trial to persuade your jury your story. I'm not sure it's necessarily a profession where people are doing that where you can be dull, because if you're dull, you're not going to be terribly persuasive. I think here we got a fairly good collection of people, both in the book and generally, a lot of people who enjoy storytelling. The work that Doyle has collected and put out into the canon is a great collection of stories, and I think it's taking those facts and drafting a story that appeals to a lot of attorneys who need to do or handle their work on a daily basis in a similar way.
I'm going to add to that at least in Canada, I'm not sure about the United States, that only about, we have the historical divide between solicitors and barristers. So barristers are the lawyers that go to court and argue cases, as Will's saying. and I think the divide or percentage in Canada, at least when I graduated, I'm not going to tell you when, I'm not going to admit to that, but it was about 10% when I graduated, and that's what I do and what Will does, and so when I'm saying that the lawyers with the outside interest and I agree with Will that those are the litigators, but 8 or 9 out of 10 lawyers, they don't go to court. They're solicitors, meaning doing, my wife calls it doing desk work, and anyway, so and along those lines, like my mom sold ladies' clothing, my dad sold men's clothing. There's an identical twin brother, and all 3 of us are trial lawyers. And I have 6 children. I think 5 are in marketing. It's all the same thing. What Will's saying, you're selling a product. Yeah. You're selling an issue, an idea. You're selling a person. And hopefully, we can sell this book too.
That's great. Well, just to circle back to the beginning, Donny, where we talked about that opening article where you reviewed those 12 items on Dr. Watson's list about Sherlock Holmes, his limits. I did want to pause on number 12 there, good practical knowledge of British law. We make the assessment, was Watson right, etc. But answer this for me. Sell me on this. How would a doctor be a good judge of whether Sherlock Holmes is knowledgeable about the law or not? Where did Watson come off with some knowledge of the British law to be able to make that judgment?
Well, I'm spoiler alert, but in the article, it says essentially that a doctor's opinion about how well versed in the law someone is about as much value as a lawyer's opinion of how good a doctor is. So, because you're crossing disciplines and getting outside of your of your own white line. So I absolutely agree with you. And the article goes through the thing. It also it went a little bit farther than the previous articles in different journals, including the BSJ. Where there was one article that argued that Sherlock Holmes was a lawyer. So, anyways, that's covered. But it went through a trial technique of assessing not only whether or not Sherlock Holmes was had a good practical knowledge of British. Whether he had. It examined rather the other 11 topics. So, if Watson said that. Holmes I'll use one example, that Holmes' knowledge of literature was nil, then that was examined through all the 60 tales, because it was relevant. If he's making the judgment about 12 things and he's wrong about on the other 11 about a majority, it takes away from his argument of what his assessment was on the 12th. So sure. It's all in there.
Excellent.
Yeah, I've always thought that there should have been another list, John H. Watson, his limitations, conducted by Sherlock Holmes. And Holmes would have written, Watson's knowledge of the varieties of tobacco seems to be nil.
But his knowledge of women is expansive.
There you go. Right. Oh. Transcontinental. Well, the book is Canon Law, Lawyer's Law and the Sherlockian Canon, edited with an introduction by William A. Walsh and Donny Zaldin. It is available for sale on the Baker Street Irregulars website. We'll have a link directly to it in the show notes. It is $39.95, and it is well worth every penny. Pick up a copy of this second entry in the Profession series over at BakerStreetIrregulars.com today. Will, Donny, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us and tell us your story.
You guys are great interviewers. Thank you very much.
This is one of the many things that I love about our shared interest here in Sherlock Holmes and these kinds of societies and associations, which is that the scope of people who are interested in this. We frequently say everyone from presidents to postmen, but there are pockets of informed and knowledgeable professionals like Will and Donny and Les Klinger and Al Rosenblatt and the late S. Tupper Bigelow and others who are so knowledgeable and also who have such gifts around expression, as we were talking with Will and Donny, expression, storytelling, convincing, making persuasive arguments, that it's great. I'm so happy that this Professions series has started, as we said, first with doctors and now with the law. And I don't know that we've announced it. I think it probably, it could be I don't suppose we're supposed to say anything about it, but the next volume is going to be on taxidermists.
It was only a matter of time.
I'm just stuffed with interest about this.
Oh, it is getting to be tax season. So, it's, wow. Well, I'm just so glad that these lawyers are using their powers for good instead of evil. This is fantastic. This is another indication that no matter where we turn, Sherlock Holmes rears his head, or we, by virtue of being interested in Sherlock Holmes, find ways to integrate Sherlock Holmes into our professions and our lives outside of just the Sherlockian world. So it's wonderful that Will and Donny were able to corral all of this material from so many learned people, as they say in the legal profession, and make this happen. Well, speaking of learned people, that music means that it's time for Canonical Couplets, of course. And if you were with us last time, you will remember that the Canonical Couplet, that two-line poem that we put together, was as follows. To trust a man inclined to laugh and fidget may mean the loss of an important digit. Bert, do you know what story that referred to?
Yes, that is the strange case of the missing undergarments, which I think was also called The Adventure of the Engineer's Thong, wasn't it?
Now that would have been a show or a story worth that the world was not yet prepared for. It's not. It's the engineer's thumb, right?
Oh, so close.
Stuck in his plum, pulled out a thumb. Yeah, and we had quite a few entries this time around. I don't know if people finally caught up with it and realized that they actually had a shot at winning this because we had a dearth in entries a while back. But we will, once again, go over to our random number generator and spin the big prize wheel and see what it comes up to. Number 8. Number 8, and that corresponds to Michael Bush. All right. Michael, congratulations. We will be in touch with how you win or how you claim your prize from the IHO's vaults. And I should note that we are the recipients of a few new volumes thanks to the generosity of listener and reader Ray Betzner. Ray was cleaning out his library and sent us a box full of books, so now we have that many more prizes to award our recipients of Canonical Couplets. Well, that means that it is time to get around to the next Canonical Couplet. Are you ready, Bert?
I'm ready.
All right. Well, here it is. When days grew dark for luckless Hector John, the woodpile shed its lurid light thereon. If you think you know the answer to this, send us an email at comment@ihearofsherlock.com. Title of the email should be Canonical Couplet. We will hopefully choose your name from among the winners and give you a prize. Good luck.
The press is a very valuable institution if one knows how to use it.
Read all about it. Telegram! Westminster murder! Read all about it. Telegram! Read all about it. Westminster murder!
I must make something of it, although I've no doubt that every newspaper in London will be on the street with a full and detailed account.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
This is As We Go to Press with Mattias Boström. One thing is for sure, Sherlock Holmes is always in the news. So let us pick a date. Our random date generator gives us, let's see, July 20th, 1947. We'll see what we can find in the newspaper archive. Oh, the first on the list is, oh, we are lucky. It's a Books Alive column by Vincent Starrett. And it's about 2 newly discovered manuscripts. It says that Adrian Conan Doyle had found in an old cardboard hat box in the strong room of Country Bank one article called Some Personalia About Mr. Sherlock Holmes and a one-act play, The Crown Diamond. And Adrian said about the Personalia article, it is a unique document containing facts which will explode the old myths about Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes. But Starrett noted that there had actually been an article with the exact name Some Personalia About Mr. Sherlock Holmes in the Strand magazine of December 1917. Did Adrian not know of this article? The same article had then been inserted in Memories and Adventures. Starrett actually recommends Mr. Adrian Conan Doyle to read the autobiography of Memories and Adventures as an important source work on his father's life and writings. What Adrian thought was a unique document never published before was that very article. Nothing happened after this find in 1947. I think the first book to reprint this article was after Adrian's death in 1973 in Peter Heining's The Sherlock Holmes scrapbook. Adrian was always exaggerating about these things. But why did Adrian think it was a unique document? He spoke about exploding the old myths, and as Starrett writes here, what old myths? For some time Mr. Adrian Conan Doyle has been endeavouring to show that his father was himself the original of the Baker Street detective. And that is exactly what was in the article. Conan Doyle mentions a few criminal cases where he was, working as a detective. And that was what made Adrian so enthusiastic. This proved in his eyes that his father had really been the model of Sherlock Holmes. In everyone else's eyes, including Conan Doyle himself, he wasn't. What irritated Vincent Starrett mostly was that Adrian and Dennis didn't want to publish these things. He writes, with every other member of the Baker Street Irregulars in this country, I look forward to quick publication of all the extant unpublished stories, plays, personalia, and memorabilia of Sherlock Holmes in private hands. And no more fooling, please. Some of us are getting along in years and can't wait.
Okay, well, that just about does it here for this episode. I should note before we move on, we are in the midst of awards season. You know, the Screen Actors Guild, the Oscars, the Emmys. You know, this is the time of the year when the entertainment world gives out its awards, and I am proud to say that Sherlock Holmes is among the conversation in some of these award shows. Have you heard?
Well, I have heard some negative ratings of the master as associated with certain films whose name must not be mentioned.
Well,
the Voldemort of movies.
Yes. Well, we all know the vehicle you're talking about. The names Watson and Holmes are in the title. Maybe they're reversed. That won a Razzie for one of the worst films out there. But Johnny Depp also was a nominee for his work in Sherlock Gnomes. So we're all over the place now. Glad to see it. Well, if you can tear yourself away from this podcast or from screens that are making you view subterranean versions of Sherlock Holmes, please write in and let us know what you think. Otherwise, we will be poised to see you in episode 162. And until that time, I remain the ever-poised Scott Monty.
And I'm the ever-porous Bert Wolder.
And together we say, The
game's afoot!
The game's afoot! I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.
The one non-Sherlockian article is on Blackmail by Caroline Mitchell and Kevin Song. And Caroline's someone I've known through college and law school. But Kevin Song was a law student who was working at the law firm where she works at in San Francisco. It ends up he was a Columbia law student, and he came back after working with her on the article to be an intern in Andy Peck's chambers.
Huh.
Yep.
How do you like that?